Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we are going to be taking another peek into voicing. Now we're going to be getting a little more into stuff, okay? We're going to start doing some composition exercises. We're finally applying stuff to music in a way that's more musical. So voicing, okay, let's talk about this, but for a little bit more real this time. Voicing is a triad. Voicing, a triad, right? Let's talk about that. What does voicing a triad mean? That's how we distribute the notes of the triad among the various parts and players. Now, I thought about this definition for a while, right? I even looked up some other people's definitions because you could have just one part. And so I decided to bring that up as a case because I feel like this definition is pretty complete. So voicing is just how we distribute. We have these notes and we distribute them among players, or we space them on an instrument such as the piano. That's how we voice our triad. A branch of voicing is called orchestration, and it's actually an upper division class, which focuses on how these things are distributed. This takes into account a ton of stuff that we just aren't prepared to take into account yet. We don't even know about some of these things that exist, so we can't really talk about orchestration. We're just going to learn the basics of voicing, but I felt like I'd at least mention like that this is like a thing. In ensembles like solo piano, when I say an ensemble, it's kind of interesting to say that, but an ensemble like solo piano, voicing is primarily looked at from how different parts of the chord, i.e. the third, fifth, we will call these sonorities because same parts of the chord. I think I do that for most of this time, but near the end I say sonorities because this gets old fast. But we're just talking about all the different parts of the chord, who gets what note, do they get the third, the fifth, what sonority do they get? So voicing is looked at on an instrument like solo piano, how they are distributed. So for example, here's an example of this. So a single triad may have many voicings. With the piano alone, here are some examples. So here, these are all C major. We've already looked at this, but they're all C major, and some of them break some rules about voicing we are going to learn in a bit, but just listen to the complete difference in quality each one of these has, despite them all being made of the same components. It's like how many atoms, I don't know, how many molecules can you get out of some set of atoms, right? Because you get ions and all these other things going on. So music's very similar in that way. So like just this is this first one. Say, oh, that's okay, here's this one. Those are the same, like that's crazy to me. That's a C major chord. 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 They all have very different roles. And very different tools. So you might be going, it's a little overwhelming at first because this means out of just one triad, we can get so much. So it's a little crazy as we begin to add things to our toolbox. And this is something that you will just naturally begin to sort of feel out as you compose more and you have other things to worry about. So it's not necessarily something that's in the forefront of your mind, but you'll begin to have preferences over what you think will fit a situation better. So what kind of voicing you want. So here we say, notice how each voicing, each spacing offers a different oral texture. So oral, you're going to hear this. I learned it first in audio engineering, but oral, like interoral timing, it just basically says you have a sense. It refers to a sense. In this case, interoral is referring to timing differences, is how your ear perceives the difference of time it takes from sound to get to one side of your head to the other. You're right, it's going to reach a delay. If it sounds over here, it's going to hit this ear first, and it's going to be delayed by a really small amount to get to your other ear. And so we get an oral texture. So this is sort of more of an artsy word. But anyways, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I mean by this, meaning it sounds different. So we get an oral texture. These things sound different. But oral texture is sort of a really fancy way. It sort of has a specific sort of sense of what it means to sound different versus just saying, wow, that sounds different. This is a little more specific, has a context to it. Because I always hate it when someone gives a definition and they say the definition like happiness is joy. You can't find one word as just another word. Why do we even have that other word? There must be a difference. Otherwise, we should just get rid of that word. There's no point. We already have one. So just so you know. And there's actually an interesting topic if you study language, like how all these things come together. Like, what does it mean? What are you really saying? What are you, when you use words? I don't know. So anyways, moving on. These oral textures are linked to tonal, atonal, and modal harmony. There's actually even more types of harmony. And I bring them up now because you're going to hear, especially when we talk about the minor mode, that about all these rules. And it's a common confusion, like what is modal harmony versus total harmony? This is a tonal harmony course. So what that basically means is in the 18th century, there was a very, there was a way to do things. And we follow this general philosophy of how to do things. And then these other types of harmony are other ways of doing things. And we can get into pitch classes and sets of notes and all these different things. Or what do they call those? Pitch sets, tone sets. I've heard them said all sorts of ways. Basically a set of notes. And you would call those set of notes, if you're using those notes, diatonic and all these other things. But anyways, the point is in voicing, we achieve oral textures, and these oral textures are linked to the different types of harmonies, literally the studies of harmony that come out of it. They're an integral part of it. So we say they often are limited by the technicalities of instruments or the harmonic constraints you choose to work with. So depending on the type of harmony you're using, like we're learning tonal harmony, that will change the way we use these voicings. And also, some instruments just can't do very good with certain setups. So we'll talk about that a little bit later down the line. Because it's really very important to keep this in mind. If someone who knows how an instrument works will be way more powerful at writing for that instrument because they know how to take advantage of it. So we say, you can see them. So this is my advice for sort of looking at voicings. You can see them as a choice, usually to achieve a emotion or mood. So when you're picking your voicings, it normally happens naturally because you've had experience with them via some exercises. So it's normally not too crazy. I learned piano, so I generally think with piano, like it's kind of a weird deal. But I learned clarinet and flute and several other instruments. So I can think in those terms too. Every time you learn an instrument, you sort of get this new way of looking at how music works. So we say, as you study harmony, you will become familiar with the endless variations, but we will be focusing on two broad categories of voicing. And they are open voicing and closed voicing. And now we've talked about these a little bit. And I gave you a really informal definition, basically saying if there was more than an octave between your notes, then there was a closer voicing available. Therefore, that was an open voicing. That was my previous definition. We did some exercises with that. Here, that definition doesn't work. It's not true. In the strict sense of 4-part writing. It's fine for, just a general, let's call this closed and this open. But when we're talking about 4-part harmony specifically, is no longer true. So this is how it's defined for 4-part just generally. This sort of evolved because everyone learned tonal harmony looking at 4 parts. So this sort of became a thing, and now it's cemented as a thing. So we say the voicings are specific to 4-part writing. These voicings, I've also seen them applied in other settings. You'll see this all the time in jazz. You'll see this in you'll hear about cluster chords, which are sort of like a specific case of close voicing. So you'll hear these things referenced. In the strict sense, close voicing is less than an octave between soprano and tenor. So our soprano and our tenor, if they're within an octave of each other, not a octave, less than an octave, they are close voiced. If they are an octave or more, they're open voiced. And so over here, these are all close. So this is a hymn out of a hymn book. I have it right here. So yeah, it's just called hymns. And these are all close voiced because our tenor is within an octave of our soprano. Now, this is a trouble spot for a lot of students. They have a hard time seeing the octave across the grand staff. So this is something you've got to just get fast at. But remember, this A would be 2 ledger lines down on this clef. It would be the A 2 ledger lines below the treble clef. So I don't really have a trick for knowing this one, guys. You just sort of have to get good at reading on the grand staff. But anyways, and these are all sort of semantics. We are going to do some practice with this, but you need to be able to identify these pretty much by looking at them. Most of the time you can look at it and be like, that looks open, but you got to check. And so you want to get good at just being able to look and quickly check. So these are all close. We get an open voicing here. So here's an A, and this is an A, right? So this would be 2 ledger lines below. This would be an octave apart. So therefore, it is an open voicing. And let me play it for you. So listen to the difference and also the tendencies that happen when, just pay attention to voicing. Just listen to voicing, determine how it impacts the song. So this is an excerpt. Obviously, that's not the end. So that's actually a cadence. We'll talk about these later. But basically, we notice here there are specific patterns because of the way we choose our voicings. And remember, our chords evolve from our scale, and our scale has these things called active steps. Remember we talked about these? So now we're mixing voicing, active steps, scales, and harmonic progression onto one thing with multiple parts. So it's getting a little dense here, okay? But we notice generally that our open voices, they can stay open for a good while, but they'll tend to contract in the general scope of things. There are other songs where it's like open the whole time and whatever. It's like a thing. But we'll learn about these. So this gets into, I just want to hint at the fact that this sort of is evolve. This will evolve into what we will call motion, which we will be studying shortly. So yeah, open, close voicing, a little bit more formal. Notice the oral effect when the open voicing appears. The open voicings will often guide your motion, italics, motion, which is the movement of a voice as it relates to other voices. So the motion of a voice, right? If we had a point and there were no other points in existence, that point could never move because it never has anything relative to move to. But as soon as you put a second point down, you suddenly can have motion. I'm not sure if that's why it's called counterpoint, but I literally just thought of that right now as a good example. But yeah, anyways, motion, important concept, relies on other things being existent. So, okay, a topic we will cover soon. Notice we tend to contract back to a close voice. So we like close voices, generally. Maybe you really don't. Maybe you hate close voices. Maybe every work you ever write will be open. I will commend you. It's also kind of weird. So we say, we do not consider the bass in our voicing. So you notice that. We say up here, there's no boy. Where's the bass? Where? And there's a reason for this. It gets into a little bit of a oral effect. Back then, I'm not sure if they knew exactly why this was true, but today we have a pretty good understanding of this. And so I typed it out here. This is because the role of the bass as it relates to the inversion. So this is what they would have told you back in the 18th century or whatever. Because we hear the lowest note as the way the chord is. It determines the sound of the chord. It is linked to how we hear it. Clarinet and a flute. So here's the example you would hear. Here's the explanation you would hear now. So a clarinet and a flute, right? They might play the same note, but it sounds totally different. And it's because each instrument actually creates an overtone set or a harmonic set. And we use overtones because it also covers the harmonics. So when I play the clarinet, I'm going to create a fundamental frequency. There's going to be a lowest frequency, and there will be a set of additional frequencies that are usually reduced in amplitude, but not always. It contributes to the way the instrument sounds. And this additional set goes on to infinity, generally, unless there's some sort of filter. While this is a really abstract example, basically I play an instrument, right? I play the clarinet. It's going to create some set of frequencies. The flute is going to create some set of frequencies as well, but they're going to be different. But the important thing is the frequency that matches is the lowest frequency. This is what we hear as the pitch of the note. I was actually asked about this. It was a concept for FM synthesis that had to do with odd ratios. So if you're into synthesis, it's really interesting because now you can determine how to make things sort of sound in tune. There's also a psychoacoustic effect that takes place. Specifically, a good case example is the bassoon, where the fundamental is almost not there at all. It's called the case of the missing fundamental. But the harmonic structure is so indicate, we imply the lowest frequency by the harmonic structure, and so our brain actually puts the note back in. So anyways, all these things basically say when things are the lowest, we tend to weight those things with a relatively high importance in how we perceive them. And so that's why we don't generally consider the bass. The bass plays a role, it's a different type of beast. You know what I'm saying? It plays a role in the way the chord sounds in a different way than the other three voices do. If you're interested in sound design stuff, I highly recommend it. It really does help you understand orchestration and the way tones combine a lot better. So we say, all right, there are two general rules. So that's voicing in general, right? We got general voicing down. But there are two general rules about voicing. We need to know about these. We want to preserve. Okay, so this is important. So we say we want to preserve the interaction between soprano and bass. Their interaction is essential. And you might be going, why? Why is theirs? And people will also call this soprano bass counterpoint. Most texts refer to it like this. But you might be going, why is this so important? Well, the bass defines the way the chord's going to sound. The soprano is the melody. If these things are confused, if you confuse either the melody or the chords, your piece will become confused. It'll be ambiguous there. This might be a useful thing for you, but in tonal harmony, we don't want that. We want to be clear and communicate what we are saying directly. In 20th century music, we want to be as ambiguous as friggin' possible. But for now, we are interested in being clear and writing tonal harmony. So as a general rule, we do not cross these voices. Where does it say? Here we have it. Do not let a voice cross the soprano. Otherwise, our melody is confused. So our soprano must maintain its independence as a part. So we do not like voicings that cross the soprano. And the same goes for below the bass. Do not let a voice go below the voice. And in this case, don't let the alto go past the soprano or the tenor go past the bass, because then our bass is confused, and that's bad news if you do that. So don't do that. This ensures our melody and chords are clear. So that's a little bit explanation. A lot of people don't tack on all this extra stuff, which I feel is pretty important stuff to say. We might ask, okay, you may be asking right now, what about the tenor and alto? Can they cross? The answer is yes, they can, but don't do it right now. You're learning the basics. We're not going to be focusing on these special cases. But basically, yeah, they can cross if there's a musical reason to do so. If you have a reason that makes sense musically, and you better have a good one, because it is pretty hard to find examples of where this takes place. So if you do it, there better be a reason. Usually it's linked to a scale figure or some sort of tension resolution. You better have like an active step resolving to a pretty powerful resolution, something of that kind. Because there's usually another way that generally is considered better. But again, it's art. It's all up to you. So here's an example, and notice, okay, so let's play it for you and just pay attention to voicings. I mean, just keep all the stuff we've been saying in mind and give it a quick look over. It's another hymn. It's called The Happy Day At Last Has Come. And here we go. So there you have it. It's very clear. The melody is distinct. And we have a nice harmonic movement. It's nice. Nothing really to say about it. And then also, I write it up here. Also for real, avoid crossing voices. Examples are few. If you do it, there better be an explanation. And your teacher, if he's a good teacher, will stop and say, why did you do this? And if you don't have a reason, you're losing points for that. Probably not a lot of points, but every mark counts. So we say 2. So here's rule 2. Some voicings, ways we voice chords, are rarely used. We don't use them very often. In general, we want to be careful of chords voiced far apart. So the sonorities. And here's why I say the whole sonority spiel. So our sonorities are far apart. We already talked about sonorities at the beginning. And for part writing, we keep soprano and alto within an octave or less of each other. And the same goes for alto and tenor. So our soprano and alto voices, the top 2 should be within an octave. The middle 2 should be within an octave. And the bass can be wherever the heck it wants because it's the bass. So for reasons we previously discussed. And then we say why? Well, because the bass defines the inversion, that's why. And the top 3 voices, so the bass defines the inversion and all those other reasons, so that's already why. But the top 3 voices fill in the chord and they play roles. And in general, the further a sonority gets away from the chord, meaning like if I played a C major chord and then instead I removed the third and played the third up here, the third becomes weaker as far as it's concerned with that chord. And if I don't have another E, but if I got higher and higher, it's going to sound more removed. So sonorities that are spaced out, voiced far apart, are no good for stuff like that. We just avoid them. They're good. They're really good. But they're not good in the sense that we think they're right now. Total harmony good. On piano, it's a different story, right? Because that's not a problem. And a lot of this, we're also taking into consideration that we're writing for 4-part SATB. So that's another consideration is what I'm trying to say. For piano, rules are a little bit different. And it also depends on the frequency range that you're using. And that's just a whole nother topic. You can go look at my sound design videos for if you're interested. Or sound and synth basics or something. As sonorities get farther and farther apart, they lose the role they play in the chord. So we keep them according to the rule above. So within an octave of each other, except the bass. And now you might be saying, are there exceptions? Well, yeah. But we are focusing on learning the basics. You can experiment with other voicings as you grow more familiar with them. So there's always going to be an exception, guys. So here it is. Here's an example. This is not okay. This is way over an octave. Sounds like this. Now you might be saying that sounds fine. We don't care that it sounds fine. It's not okay. This is too far apart. If this was a 4-part part, our voices, this would be, one voice would be too far removed. It wouldn't sound cohesive. So here's another example. This one's capital no. This is very far. This is over an octave apart from this one. So this one's within the octave, but this one is not. And so this is a common mistake across the grand staff. People miss the octave gap. Which I also mentioned, I believe, either earlier in this video or the previous video. I can't remember when I said it. Oh my gosh, that's not good. Anyways, we have way more than an octave gap here. That's bad. It doesn't, in this case, it just sounds sort of naked. And our bass is unison with our tenor, which isn't bad. It's just, it's not a great sounding sound right now. And then over here, this one's a yes. Notice it is an open voicing because here's a G and this is a C. And our alto kind of fits the middle for us, fills it in. So this is a yes. For choir, we are happy. All right. The grand staff, here it is. The grand staff often confuses, often confuses students. These mistakes are all over some students' work, especially when they come into the tutoring center. And it's just everywhere. And could be avoided if you just learn to read better. Honestly, take the time to learn to read fast on the grand staff, or this is going to be a painful process. I've had people who understand these concepts, but because they don't know how to read on the grand staff very fast, they're literally held back from being able to progress. And so it's not that hard, guys. Get a book. Here's a book. See, here's a hymn book. It's got a bunch of notes on there. I'm not sure if it's focusing or not, but go through and just write above every single note the letter name of that note. Do it for the whole friggin' book on both staffs. You will get really fast, and just do it for like what? Do it for 15 minutes a day for a week. I guarantee you're going to get so dang quick at this. So just do it. So that's just my spiel on that. Because I'm always sort of like, we're going to spend forever making these silly mistakes instead of moving on to the actual subject. Finally, we will be writing for voice most of the time. When writing for an instrument, so this it's not included in the book, but the instructors will always bring this up. When writing for an instrument, remember, some notes and leaps are easier than others. On the piano, large jumps, totally okay. If you're a singer, large jumps, not totally okay, much more difficult to pull off. Some notes will sound better than others. This is one I notice some people, on a voice it makes sense. Like if you reach the extreme of the range, it's not gonna sound as good. So that makes sense. But on like an instrument like the clarinet, it has a register called the throat tone register, which is ironically right around the middle of the register. Well, I guess it's to like the bottom half, the top part of the bottom half of the register of the clarinet. And that register just does not sound that great unless you have a really good player who has a good ear and has an excellent barrel on their clarinet. It's the middle piece that the mouthpiece goes to. So we call them throat tone registers. They're the registers where almost no keys are being held down. Like if you had no keys and you just played the clarinet, just blew a note, you would get a G. And it just doesn't sound that great. It's sort of a thin texture, not good. But if you were to play the G with all the fingers down, well, I mean, not all of them, but the lower G, it actually sounds really rich and full. And it's the sound people typically think of when they think of the clarinet, if they're thinking of the lower range. So being aware of these tones and these instrument problems is really important. As a writer, maybe it's not a great idea to put the clarinet there unless you're going to be working with really good clarinet players. It is, however, also a very easy note to play. And so for grade school level, it's ironic because it sounds not so great and their tone usually is bad already as it is, but it's an easier note to play. So they generally end up playing it. It's this horrible paradox. We need to solve it with the clarinet. But anyways, every instrument's like that. They all have their own things. I'm mentioning that just because I'm very familiar with the clarinet. It depends. Yeah. So anyways, be aware of that when you're picking voicings. Also, players need to breathe. Okay? We're not robots. Don't forget. Piano players, they don't need to breathe. String players, they don't need to breathe. We're taught to breathe, ironically, as part of the music. It's part of the expressiveness. It's a whole different sort of breathing, though, if that makes any sense. Well, that better make sense. You're not like breathing to play your instrument. We largely will ignore this for now. But I guarantee if you do this, musicians will mention it if it's a solo piece. In ensembles, it's less big of a deal. It's common practice, right? If you're playing a part and there's obviously no rest anywhere and I'm playing clarinet, I got to figure out where I'm going to breathe. So I'll turn over to the person next to me and I'll say like, hey, I'm going to breathe on beat 3 and then come in. And then you can breathe on the next beat 1. And we'll alternate breathing. And ideally, we'll come in perfectly. So it's always in balance. But this often affects the performance noticeably. But in ensembles, that's how it's dealt with. So if you're writing for ensembles, not so big a deal. Because we're writing pretty much for choir, we're going to largely ignore it. And often when you're singing words, you'll have natural spots where breathing will come up. So we're not going to worry about things like this. But I do want you to use common sense and be aware of, people need to breathe. Just because I've seen a lot of silly mistakes. Because we are writing for an instrument, that instrument will have a range. And I hope this isn't news, but I'm going to mention some silly mistakes I see all the time. But as such, we all have vocal ranges. I personally can sing about an F2 to a C4. So I could sing kind of low to not very high. That's just my personal range. And at this range, above that, if you want me to sing above a C4, if you can still hear after you've heard me do that, you'll fire me. And I simply just F2 is sort of the limit. I can get down to an E if I really try, but F2 is really pushing it. And I would be unable to sing fast or articulate very quickly in such a low range. I say this because I see a lot of times instructors will have you write like clarinet and flute parts as an accompaniment, usually flute because it's concert pitch with the piano bass line. And I've just seen a lot of flute register parts that are way too low, and I play flute too. So it's like, I look at this and I go, man, this is the lower end of the flute. This would be ridiculous for a regular flute to go at. But if you have like an alto flute, it has like a bent head joint. It's a little bit longer. It's a lot easier for them to play nimbly down there. It's easier for them to be light on their fingers, light on their feet, however you want to look at it. Because the low end of the flute, it's pretty hard to make those tones. So there's actually bass flute, alto flute, which are greater for that register. Otherwise, move your register up to a higher register. A lot of the reason students do this too is because the playback and muse score sounds better. They like the playback more. I don't care what the playback sounds like in muse score. That's not how the real player is going to sound like when they play it. Okay, so just be aware of that. If you're going to write that low, write for an alto flute, or deliberately write in a way that you don't expect a flute player to play. Because, so when we're picking ranges, be reasonable. That's all I'm saying. Just be reasonable. And just because your DAW sounds a certain way doesn't mean it's going to sound that way in real life. So, and a lot of these mistakes will happen on accident. Like if you don't play tuba and you've never written for tuba and suddenly you're going to write some stuff for tuba, you might not know that like an F in the bass clef is considered a terribly high note. Like you just might not know stuff. So This is like a whole separate study. It's approached later on, but just be aware if you're going to write. And so as we write for voice, these ranges we have selected here, largely the vocalists, vocal performers, they will have mastered their range. A lot of them will even have bigger ranges than this. So we're going to pretend that, we're writing for pros. So these should not be troublesome ranges. So we don't have to worry about technical details like that. We're more concerned with the mechanics of harmony through here. But I just wanted to throw that all out there because a lot of times I see students who have just never considered a lot of these ideas. And they're pretty straightforward common sense ideas if you play a horn regularly, but it also depends on the horn you play. Like if you're a singer, singers are like, they think in a whole different category. And if you learn sight singing, you'll understand why they think the way they do. A lot of them are missing a lot of fundamentals. You just didn't even know you could learn music without, like rhythm reading, sight singing. A lot of them don't know how to do that. They only know if someone plays for them the thing, then they figure out how to sing it. Where on clarinet, you play notes and then bang, the note comes out. When I first played with violins in the ensemble, I was totally like, it didn't make sense to me that they didn't know exactly where G was on their instrument. I'm like, you put these fingers down, the note comes out, then you just got to make sure you make the green light happen on the tuner. That was my life. But for them, it's a different deal. Your finger moves around. The things are different. That's a long time ago, but it's just interesting reminiscing about some of this stuff. Some of the mistakes I made a lot of weird, bad mistakes that if I just played another instrument would have been more apparent to me. So anyways, here are our ranges. You need to memorize these. So from C to G for the soprano, from lower G to D for the alto, the tenor. This is actually that's a G, I believe. Normally, tenor, you'll have the tenor reach up to like here. So this is D, E, F, G. Yeah, it's a G. I got that right. So when you're writing, you'll tend to get in a mode. My ledger line reading on the bass clef, 3 ledger lines up. I know it's an E on the treble clef because I played flute. And then we have down here, we have an E to a C for the bass. So just keep it in these ranges. If your stuff goes out of this range, it's considered wrong. We do not worry about range too much, again, because we're going to be working with pros who claim to be singers. Not me, okay? I'm not a singer, but I can use auto-tune. And please use common sense. So anyways, that's a longer lesson. I was kind of like, I knew this one was going to be hefty just because there's a lot of little details, a lot of things come up. There's different examples. There's oral examples. So we're going to do some exercises with this. And yeah, subscribe, support me on Patreon. It really helps me have the motivation to do this. I'm actually starting to generate a little bit of income, which is a great motivation to put more energy into this. And have a blessed day.